I'm Suchitra, and I work at Harm Reduction International. I'm the communications officer at Harm Reduction International. And so we are a research and policy advocacy organization. I handle the communications for that organization.
May I ask why drug reform is important to you, and was there an event that you can think of that you can tell us about that made you feel like drug reform was needed?
I actually can pinpoint right down to an essay I did when I was an exchange student at Trinity College, Dublin, in Ireland. I was studying law there, and in one of my classes, I ended up doing an essay on drug use in Irish prisons. So I was poring over these prison reports about drug use in the prisons, and report after report after report, the one thing that I kept coming back to is that this is such a cyclical process. There are all these social and policy issues that push people into using drugs, which then pushes them into prison. Once they're in prison, prison is not a healing environment. It doesn't heal them of the social structural problems that got them there in the first place. And then we let people out of prison without any support on release. And then they're pushed back into the very same environment that pushed them into drug use in the first place, with even more disadvantages because they have a criminal record, they have not been given the medical services they need, a whole host of issues. So what I realized is that this cyclical pattern is clearly a result of political choices and of policy choices that have been made.
So you feel stigma is actually one of the issues, you'd think?
Yeah, I think it's also, I definitely think it's one of the biggest barriers to reform as well. I think that one of the ways in which the drug war has been the most successful is the mindset the mindset that we have internalized about drugs, about drug use, about people who use drugs, and what their value is, what even constitutes a drug user. I would argue that almost all of us are drug users. We drink coffee, we drink wine, we have sugar, but some drugs have been made illegal. And the people who use those have been made illegal, because we know that, when you criminalize drugs, what you're doing is you're actually criminalizing the people who use them. One of the barriers, according to me, is really that stigma, which is how do we dismantle that stigma in our own heads, where we start to question ourselves, our prejudices, and we realize that all of these laws and policies, they don't exist in a vacuum.
Could you possibly tell us about a conversation you've had with someone about drug policy reform? Like how would you go about it? For example, my mother is very traditional, let's say, and she thinks drugs are bad. How do you start a conversation with someone like that?
What has worked for me, in terms of what I think is most effective, is actually asking people questions. Because I think people are more empathetic and than we give them credit for. So if you ask them why they believe what they believe, why should ask them whether, if your family member was having a problematic relationship with drugs, would you want to give them help, or do you think that they should go to prison? I think that's usually the starting point. With the very basic level, I try to get that point across, that whatever happens, prison and criminalization always compounds the problem. And when you kind of personalize the issue, people realize that they wouldn't generally want somebody who's very close to them going to prison.
So could you tell us a bit about your role on promoting racial justice and decolonizing drug policy, as you've sort of mentioned previously?
Working on drug policy in the US was a huge learning experience, because, as I mentioned, examining the history of drug laws in the US is really getting a masterclass in how racism can be enshrined in law. Because when you look back at the laws, we know that when you look back at when these laws were passed and why these laws were passed, we see time and time again that the reasons why they were passed was not because a drug posed a certain risk, or it wasn't based on different levels of risks that each drug has, but it was based very much on racism in the US. The first cocaine laws were associated with Black people. Marijuana laws were associated with Mexican immigrants. Opium laws were associated with Chinese immigrants working on railroads. So what we see is that drugs were made illegal by connecting them, associating them with certain communities, and then deliberately associating them with certain communities, and then using that to criminalize those communities. We see that as recently as in the 70s, when the war on drugs in the US officially started, which was officially started by Richard Nixon in 1971. And it was used to vilify anti-war protesters who were protesting the Vietnam War, and Black people. And actually, one of his close aides, John L. Rickman, has a famous quote that came out a few years ago in a magazine about how he basically said that we couldn't criminalize people for being protesters, and we couldn't criminalize people for being Black. So we criminalized these drugs, we associated with these communities, and then we use these to disrupt the communities. So learning about that was, it put a lot of these policies into context. And then not only was this the history of the laws, but you see that this racist origin is very much alive in the way that it's implemented today. And it's very much alive in the way that it plays out in society in the US today, but also in all the other places that it was exported to. Because what happened is that the US used the mechanism of the UN, where it had an outsized amount of influence, to get other countries to adopt similar language about these laws through their 3 different drug conventions, where countries not only had to sign this on the international level, but also incorporate the provisions of these laws into their national laws. So you see in a lot of countries, you'll see laws criminalizing drugs, which come around in the 70s and the 80s, which never existed before. Many of them criminalized drugs that were traditionally used in those countries and had been used for hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. So it exported this very punitive logic that, drugs are bad, people who do them are bad, and so we should criminalize them. And there was this exporting of the global war on drugs. When we started talking about this in my current organization, we started talking with some colleagues who had been working on decolonizing public health. One of my close colleagues, Colleen Daniels, has been working on decolonizing public health, because we understand this dynamics that come into play when you talk about these global systems. And we convened a group of organizations working on drug policy all over the world, a group of brilliant minds. And we realized that, we should start this conversation about how can we use drug policy reform to dismantle these racist and colonialist structures of power. And the reason we can do that is because they are based on racism and colonial thinking and colonial structures of power. So this is work that colleagues have been doing on the ground, and through their legislatures in different countries. So we just wanted to bring the group together and start talking about this on an international level, essentially talking about how we can, drug policy reform is just a tool in the toolkit that we can use to dismantle these racist and colonialist structures of power.
So I also wanted to ask that, why do you think, from what I've read, why do you think there's so much stigma in Asia?
Yeah, well, firstly, I'd say that stigma and discrimination against people who use drugs is really a worldwide phenomenon. It manifests in different ways, and of course, there's a spectrum, but it really is a worldwide phenomenon, and we see that in many places. I think in countries like Indonesia and the Philippines and Sri Lanka, drugs are also sort of a scapegoat. They're elevated by governments and policymakers as the problem, so that they can use this narrative conveniently to be seen as though they are in control, and then they can use that to expand law enforcement and surveillance. We see that in the Philippines, where they're used to commit extrajudicial killings of people. And in those places, I think they've also ran with the laws that were exported. So they've taken it and they've gone, 10 degrees ahead, in places where these policies are very punitive and very repressive, and the public health approach is missing. There's also very little understanding of the sort of like structural factors that play into drug use. You see, like with marijuana, for example, now the country that exported these laws to the entire world, the US, is now legalizing it for adult use, which is great for the US, but it shows you how unequal the world is in terms of we took it and we ran with it. And I think that's also part of this decolonization process. Often with drug laws, what you see is that these laws that were either through colonial powers or the imperialist power, that is the US, that exported them, it's often this sort of long lasting impacts of that is that we internalize those. So the ways in which colonial thinking and punishment was used against by colonial powers against people in countries that were formerly colonized, we've actually taken that and internalized it, and now we inflict it upon our own citizens. So I think that has a part to play as well.
Finally, what can we do as individuals?
I think dismantling the stigma, like I said, I think that's such a crucial part. Talking to people is such a crucial part. Reading is such a crucial part, and learning about the various impacts of this brutal war on drugs that's been exported around the world.